First of all, I want to say thank you to the BPO. I have been a board member for many years, and one thing I'm really proud of is our mission to create opportunities for dialogue on salient issues that impact the school community. So happy that Stephen is here, and Priya and David. We appreciate this opportunity to talk outside of a school committee meeting. And I just want to start by giving you guys a couple of minutes to introduce yourself or say something about you that we may not know or that you want us to know. I'm going to start with Stephen because he's first on my screen. Stephen, you want to say hi?
Hi, everyone. Nice to see everyone here. My name is Stephen Ehrenberg. I'm a school committee member. I'm in my fourth and final year on the school committee. I'm not standing for re-election this year. I've got two girls, one of whom is still at Lawrence, and looking forward to the conversation tonight.
Thanks, Stephen. Priya, you're up next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Priya Tahiliani. I am, as Ben said, the superintendent of the Brockton Public Schools. And before that, I was the superintendent of the Everett Public Schools. But I'm a career educator. I was a teacher for 15 years in the Boston Public Schools. And I have two kids here in Brookline, one who's at BHS and one who's at Runkle.
Oh, thanks, Priya. David, last but not least.
Good evening, everyone. I'm David Pearlman. I'm a member of the Select Board, as Ben mentioned. Prior to that, I served on school committee for 6 years, the last 2 of which I was chair of the school committee. I grew up in Brookline. I've lived in Brookline since I was 4 years old. In my professional life, I'm a child welfare attorney, and I'm glad to be here.
Thanks, David. So I think everybody on this call probably recognizes that on February 6th, just a couple of months ago, the school administration announced that there was, I think it's an $8.2 million gap between the budget that they were proposing and the allocation that we're given. I thought it would be really useful to start talking a little bit with, maybe starting with Priya on what the process looks like in Brockton as a superintendent, maybe a little bit about what best practices are when her district is facing budget gaps, how do they address them, and how do they ensure that their budget proposal as an administrator, how do you ensure that your budget proposal aligns with your district's mission and values? Priya, in all her glory, arranged a slide deck for us. So do you want to go ahead and share that and start?
Yes, and you guys can let me know if it shares well. Hopefully it does, and y'all can see it.
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. So yes, I'm more of a visual learner, so I hope it's okay. It'll guide me through answering some of the questions that were posed. And thank you so much for inviting me to provide my perspective. Brockton was actually in a similar situation to Brookline a few years ago. And so, in fact, you may have read about the $18 million deficit that was facing Brockton back in 2023. But I am proud to say that now we actually have a $7.2 million net school spending carryover for this current fiscal year. And we're actually planning for a $7.8 million net school spending carryover for next fiscal year.
So Priya, when you say carryover, you mean that does that mean there's a surplus?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And for some reason it is not moving forward. There we go. So yes, and that unfortunately is not the best way to budget either. In the best case scenario, you should be level. You should have spent every single dollar on students in the fiscal year that you're in. But because of the way the historical budget was in Brockton, and because of trying to, get through figuring out some kinks in that historical budget, which wasn't kept as well as it could have been, we had to sort of change around how we were budgeting entirely. So in the future, hopefully, so in 2 fiscal years, I imagine we'll be planning with a completely level budget, which means you expended every single dollar of your net school spending on students, which is how it should be. So this year, what we're working on is reinvesting those funds into our students and schools. So just to let you know a little bit about, the budget cycle, which is very similar here. It starts when the governor's budget is released in January. As a school system, we immediately begin planning. We start with our different departments, such as athletics, arts, and then the content areas. Obviously, enrollment projections are a huge part of our budgeting process, and that's what we utilize as we're meeting with our school leaders to determine their budgets and their staffing. And once we have planned for all of the departments and the schools, we then conduct internal budget reviews where we go through all of the requested potential additions and even reductions that may have been proposed by department heads and school leaders. And during those, I tend to invite school committee members so they can sort of see what that process looks like at the table so that they can ask questions and provide input, even though we all know that the part where they're providing the greater input and where they're also bringing in their constituent perspectives is when we then have the budget committee meeting of the wholes, the public hearing. So we have several of those. And then once the school committee approves the budget, then we have to take it to city council for their approval. And then obviously after that, once the budget is passed, it's all about monitoring and reporting after July 1.
So can I jump in with a question?
Absolutely.
So and I'm happy to wait if that makes more sense. But you said that the budget planning process starts at the end of January. What's
Correct.
happening before January? There must be some conversation.
Yeah. So from July to December, we are monitoring and reviewing. We want to make sure, and I'll actually tell you a little bit more about that in this presentation, how we monitor and review, because those are some of the things. So I was in Everett for 4 years, and now this is my first year in Brockton. So I'm bringing a lot of the things that we had done in Everett to ensure that our monitoring is like down to the penny and that it is more transparently communicated to the school committee and then the broader community. But one of the things we also do that I know you had mentioned is how do we think about the budget? And again, context matters. It's all about what is important to a community. I've always learned that a budget is a demonstration of your priorities. So it's important to align our budget with our overall strategy. So for example, in Everett, we had adopted the whole child development approach as a teaching philosophy that focuses on 5 components. But we also had our 4 core values that we wanted to make sure we were keeping in mind as well. So then when we're presenting our budget, when we had new investments, for example, you see here that we're making an investment this year, for example, in social emotional coordinators, a social emotional manager in the amount of $896,000. And you can see that we're aligning it not only with our core value of cultivating a welcoming environment for our students, but with a component of the whole child approach that focuses on creating positive developmental relationships. Now, in Brockton, as we are thinking about how to reinvest money into our students, so of that net school spending carryover, we're handling it a little bit differently. Again, context matters. Since we're in that fortunate position, we did have to kind of go through a mid-year budget almost, where we reached out and received many budget requests from our school committee and our overall school community. And so here you'll see that we actually aligned to the 5 objectives of our strategic plan. And so that's how we are thinking about our budget. Now, again, this works backwards too. So in the case where you have to be in the unfortunate position of cutting the district budget, these methodologies, I think, are just as important. So when we've had to make budget cuts in the past, when I was in Everett, one of the things that we kind of always hold sacred, because it's always at the center of every whole child development, your strategic plan, are student-facing services. So we always try to hold those sacred. So for example, when I had to cut $5 million from my former district, we had to cut a lot of positions. From central office, we had to eliminate materials, supplies, and in fact, and you make cuts to things that are admittedly important, such as we had to make cuts to translation and interpretation and printing of materials, but our goal was to keep all teaching positions. So that was something that, you have to make a sacrifice on one end in order to retain, services on the other end. And so one of the ways too, we are promoting transparency in our budgets in both of my districts. So this is something we have just started in Brockton, is through a partnership we have with a consultant called Open Architects, who builds live dashboards for analyzing all of our data, everything from MCAS to payroll. So here you'll see one of our dashboards, and this just went live last month. So my school committee members actually just received access this week and can now sign in and pull our year-to-date budget spending report. So here you can see our $251 million budget, what we've expended of that, and they can break it down in any which way that they want. So for example, here on the next slide, we're just pulling out school spending, and these can even be expanded to show personnel costs versus material costs. So these have been created. Now my school committee has access to them, so they can go on at any time and see where our budget is, see where our transportation, our special ed out of district placement budget is. And then what we are doing next is we're going to be embedding this onto our website so that even the general public would be able to do this as well. And then each year too, we actually create a budget book that we put on our website and distribute to the community. It's more of an explanatory document because we don't expect all of our stakeholders to understand school budgets, but we still want to make sure that everybody in our community is able to understand not only where our money comes from, but also how we are spending it. So here you'll see sort of the budget book where we're walking through what is the budget cycle, the budget process, and explaining it. And then even go into various aspects of our budget. So trying to move it forward. So anyway, so those were just a couple of things that I wanted to share about how we manage our budget.
Wow. Can I just say wow about those dashboards?
Yes, we're very excited about them.
Stephen and David, what do you think about those dashboards?
That's enviable.
Yes, very impressive.
Right. I think that's really amazing. One of the frustrations that I've had as somebody who does look at the budget book pretty religiously is my frustration around like not being able to double click into some of those items to see like where those inputs are and sort of what the real life current state is for them. So that's pretty amazing. How long did it take, incidentally, to move to those dashboards?
So I've been there for, this is now my 9th month there. So, I mean, obviously I don't write the coding for those things. So that's all the consultant. And they actually, this is a consultant that works with DESE too. So they are actually recommended by DESE, and I'd worked with them in Everett, mostly on the enrollment projections, because that was a really difficult part for us in Everett, especially during COVID years when we, you know, our enrollment was kind of all over the place. So it was hard to do projections. But they were actually recommended by DESE, and luckily they are now working with Brockton as well. So they're the ones who do all of the back end and work on that and can really do it for any district.
Right. Wow, that's really amazing. So I wanted to pick up on something that you touched on at your prior district where you had to cut $5 million. Are you able to speak from a superintendent's point of view on what the steps are when you're deciding what needs to get cut? How are you deciding that? How does that happen? What conversations are happening behind the scenes? And what's, at what point are you bringing that to school committee?
So we actually, it was a long process. We had to have many conversations. We actually invited the union to the table first and had them, because I was actually relatively new to the district at that point as well. And so part of it was just me trying to understand the budget, understand all of the expenditures. So the union was a really important part of that in helping to understand what were the services that were student facing and needed to stay. And then we brought in partners, our school committee members, and the cuts were painful. I'm not, you know, there was personnel that needed to be cut. It wasn't from student facing services, but sometimes that doesn't hurt any less. But our goal was, and we agreed on the goal together. And I think that was the most important part, is making sure that we were all on the same page as what is our goal here. And when we decided that our goal, especially in entering COVID, is entering remote learning, that our goal was to keep student-facing services and teaching positions, that made everything else a little bit easier. So I think it's really important to come together with the different groups, your different stakeholders, and decide what your priority is at that moment. And then everything else goes from there.
So is that happening in a conversation at the school committee table, or that's happening elsewhere?
It was both.
Mhm.
It was both. So, you know, it was almost like a daily conversation, and then we bring it to school committee, have the conversation publicly so that school committee members could ask questions, so that we could explore together what were, you know, places that were appropriate to cut, what weren't. And again, as the steward of the district, right? Like, I was new to the district. It's important for me to hear from everybody about what the values of the community are. So where are the areas that just, it's a non-negotiable and it has to stay, because every community is different. And so I have to make sure that I am enacting what is important to that community.
Got it. No, that makes a lot of sense. I'm going to zoom out a little bit and take a minute to recognize that many districts across Massachusetts, and I imagine across the country, are also facing budget deficits and budget gaps. What, in your opinion, are the best practices in school budgeting now, so that we, you know, hopefully Brookline can turn around the way Brockton has, and one day end up in a budget surplus situation?
You know, there are so many challenges with districts right now, and we're seeing that a lot of them too were ones that had to do with our ESSER funds, our ARPA funds. I think we were well warned that there was going to be a fiscal cliff. And so I know that it was something we were sort of planning for in my last district. So we were very clear about and strategic about our investments to ensure that, you know, it hurt less when those funds dried up. So right now it is a really challenging time. I think there are 45 districts who are looking for overrides right now. Transportation costs have gone up, special education tuition costs have gone up. And so I think what's important is to just recognize that, you know, that is the reality, and start to think. So we've even started to plan for those rising costs moving forward and figuring out how we're going to sustain them. I know one of the things we're working on is creating a special education stabilization fund, which is something we did in my last district. So, you know, we can support some of those, you know, exorbitant costs when they come in and we're not expecting them. But I think it's almost like you're expecting the unexpected. You know that these rising costs are going to come, and that you have to be very clear with the community early on. I think that early communication about here's where we are, here's what we're looking at in future fiscal years is really important, because there are going to be cuts, and you just have to, and I think it's best to communicate those early and include everybody in the conversation, because when they come, then it makes it a little easier to, you know, to swallow, because people have been part of the conversation early on.
So can I ask, it sounds like also managing the costs on a regular basis is critically important. What does that look like in Brockton on a whatever it is, on a monthly basis, in terms of what gets reported out to school committee?
So we were creating monthly year-to-date reports and expenditure reports that were given to our school committee. We will still do that, even though now they can kind of go on and see where it is, but it's definitely an area where we'll talk about what is our burn rate, what are we looking at. So one of the areas where we've really been looking closely is our transportation costs, as everybody else is, because they're really rising. So one of the things that we've been doing, and again, every district has like slightly different issues. So one of the issues that we identified in really drilling down into our transportation costs is that we were looking at private vendors, or we employed private vendors, and thinking about how we can streamline those costs. What are the efficiencies we can build in there? How can we build in better routing systems? How can we leverage even our internal resources more. So there have been areas where we've been able to kind of cut spending because we were spending at a really high rate. So it's a small one, but we were able to cut $34,000 per month for the last 4 months of the year on one specific route. And so it's these like little bitty, it's about drilling down deep to figure out where the efficiencies can be. And then scaling that back out the following year. So now that we're doing it, because again, I'm new to the district, so I'm learning how they've done this all along. We're figuring out those areas, those weak points where we can find savings, and then we're planning for next fiscal year so that we can have those savings all year long. Whereas right now it's a little bit hard because we're course correcting in the middle of the school year. But I think that's what's important about the monitoring is you really not only have to monitor, but you have to really look at, is this the best way to spend this money? Is there a way we can do it that where we're providing the same service, but at a lesser cost?
Right. And I love that you're even thinking about, these, what you call small amounts of money where it's $35,000. But, for many of us like me who have children in the schools, $35,000 is almost an FTE. So,
exactly.
For us, it's important to protect and preserve that. I'm going to shift a little bit. Yeah.
Can I just jump in and say that I just want to echo what Priya said about how there's no substitute to doing this in a disaggregated way. I see that Dr. Schmuckler is on this call. She's our interim director, deputy superintendent for the Office of Student Services at our last school committee meeting. She and her office took the time to study our out-of-district placement and make a more fine-tuned projection about out-of-district tuition costs that you can only really get done when you're looking at a case-by-case basis. And doing it in that student-by-student way, she was able to make a determination that gave us a much more precise look at what those costs were, which actually brought the projection down considerably. There's just no substitute to taking that fine-grained look. Just wanted to put that in.
I totally agree, and I really appreciate that work. Stephen, I was actually going to turn to you and ask you if there was more in what Priya just shared that resonated for you, because I know I heard some things that we're struggling with in Brookline, but I wonder if there are some things that actually caught your ear that you would like to see integrated.
Well, I'm just so impressed by how evidence-based all of your decision-making is, Priya, and how organized you are with your data dashboard. It's a practice that I'm sure Brookliners would love to see here in Brookline. Obviously, that was a big thing that caught my attention. Other reactions?
A question I have, if I may, something that Priya noted regarding your approaching the union to get their feedback about how to form your budget. I'm curious what your strategy was to that, because oftentimes unions might bristle at being consulted on cuts that are going to impact them adversely.
And I thought that might be the case, but I actually believe that they invited that conversation. It was the first time I've ever done it that way. Normally we're sitting down at the negotiations table, but this was a different conversation. And I think I was coming to them from an inquiry standpoint as well. It was about me learning. It was about me hearing from them. And actually, while it is hard to make those decisions, at the end of the day, the goal was the same for all of us. We knew the cuts had to be made. And I honestly, I think it was actually valuable for us to do that exercise together. And I think they preferred to be included. It's hard to be included in that. Those are tough decisions to make. But I think at the end of the day, they preferred to be included than not.
So speaking of the different state, oh, sorry, my dog is going bonkers. So speaking of the different stakeholders and people involved in the budget process, Stephen, I was hoping you could talk from your point of view as a school committee member about your role in the process itself. Like we see on February, like this year it was February 6th when the budget is presented to you, but what's happening before that, if anything?
Sure. So the process is a little different in Brookline. I would say our first inputs are that we develop a budget guidelines document that we deliver to the administration wherein the school committee tries to identify what its priorities are. And we try to restrict our priorities to statements of, well, first we have our values, and then we try to derive from those values what we want to see prioritized in the budget book that comes out in January. This past couple of years, it's been a little bit different because we've had, for the first time since I've been here, which isn't that long, a strategy. And so in the budget guidelines, we try to commit ourselves to fully supporting the strategy, but then we also pull out items that we want to see supported. For instance, we want to see a strong classroom teacher to student ratio preserved in the budget. So that's an early input into the budget process. Then I'm not, it's not as clear to me what the budget process is until the budget book is delivered. I understand there's, I'm not on the finance subcommittee. And then there's the process of figuring out what the whether there's a gap and whether we need to make changes to the budget to meet to close that gap, which is where we've been these last 2 years. In Brookline, of course, we have a structural problem, but we mostly deal with that structural problem with regular overrides. So I think it was a surprise to most of the school committee that the projected budget gap was so large coming into this year at 8.2 million. But now I'm going farther afield from your original question, which was about process, right, Donna?
Yeah.
So do you want to know about a specific, just how the process works throughout?
I'm interested in what your role as a school committee member is. One thing that I found a little bit confusing was I rewatched the February 6th meeting recently, and the budget gap was announced, I think it was 8.2. And the floor was then sort of given to the administration to come back with proposals to plug that gap or address that deficit. And I'm wondering, I don't know how it works in other districts, and maybe Priya, you can speak to this a little bit, but is there no point where the school committee can jump in and say, this is what's important to us? So initially, for example, on that February 6th meeting, was there an opportunity to say, this is what's important to us, and this is where we want you to start looking when you're looking at cuts?
So I would say that there isn't a norm around this, first of all. This typically hasn't happened, that there's a budget gap so large that the process becomes that the administration has to bring us meaningful choices to make, where it becomes the school committee's responsibility to make choices about how to close the gap that are aligned with the values that we've articulated, and now also the strategy. So that's the first point. I'm sorry, can you say your question again, Dana? I'm a little off today.
No, that's okay. We should tell everybody that you're not feeling well.
But let's just keep doing it.
Yes, but you're like such a champ for being here. So I'm just wondering, for example, on that February 6th meeting,
Oh, right. So I think we would mostly think that's micromanagement. It's the school administration's responsibility to come to us with what they think a vision of excellence in education is. And it's the school committee's responsibility to approve or not approve the budget that they present to us. If we start coming to them saying, we think this is or is not part of an excellent education, that's really overstepping our role, in my view, and I think most of the school committee's role. I think we take our first swing when we articulate that budget guidelines document saying, these are our priorities, which are derived from our values. Please take that into consideration when embodying excellence in this district. And then to go on and say, this program we like, this program we don't, that's out of our scope. When we get to the point where we've gotten to, though, when closing an $8.2 million deficit, we can't get to closing that deficit with the cuts that were put on the table by the district, by the administration. I think at that point, the school committee started to ask about whether a certain area might contain efficiencies. For instance, I asked about whether we could do a deep dive into out-of-district costs, because I just didn't understand the data that was coming in around that. And it turned out when Dr. Schmuckler did her analysis, she was able to find cost efficiencies in that area. That's not really an example of a direct request for a cut proposal in that area. But I think the school committee starts to feel emboldened to ask for more and more proposals about certain areas when it became clear that it was a pretty immense task to close a budget deficit, a budget gap of this size.
Right.
Does that answer your question then?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I was thinking a little bit more generally, sort of some statement of values. Like, we want to stay away from student facing cuts, or, we want to try to preserve the student teacher ratios, but I understand what you're saying. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I guess in those first conversations with the administration about it, it should be incumbent upon us to say things like that in response to the administration, that but anything more specific than that,
Right.
It seems to me to be an overstep.
Right.
To a point.
Okay, I want to shift a little bit and have David jump in, if that's okay. David has had the opportunity to sit at the school committee table and now at the select board. And so I'm hoping, David, you can kind of give us a better understanding of how the town side budget works and how it overlaps with the school side budget process. And then also a little bit about the different bodies that have a role in the school budget process, advisory committee, town meeting, and the select board.
Sure, happy to do so. So taking it a bit more macro level, municipal revenues come from 5 primary sources: property taxes, about 79.5%, state aid, 5.6%, local receipts, those are excise taxes, fees, fines, etc., at 7.6%, free cash, 4.6%, and enterprise revolving funds at about 8.5%. So from a school funding perspective, how does all this money get divided? Through something known as the Town School Partnership, which is a revenue split that first identifies shared costs between the departments, both town side and school side, and then splits the remaining revenue equitably between the schools and various town departments. Typically, this has been about a 60-40 split here in Brookline, with schools receiving 60%. Now, what does this look like in terms of real numbers? For FY26, the town's $456.6 million budget, which starts on July 1st, is about a $19.3 million increase, or 4.4% from the 2025 budget. For this year, the fixed or above the line costs for Brookline total $177 million, which is an increase of $9.3 million, or about 5.3% from the current fiscal year. These above the line fixed costs go to pensions, health insurance, other forms of insurance, and debt service. It also covers the reserve fund. Since this expense category is not assigned to any particular department, its costs are reduced off the top from the town school partnership revenue split. For FY26, the debt service portion of these fixed costs is approximately $44 million. This is what we are paying right now toward current school building and fire station projects between principal and interest on the debt. Now, after we subtract the $177 million in fixed above the line costs, we are left with $141.7 million as the recommended allocation to the public schools of Brookline, which had put forward that initial budget proposal of $149.9 million that Stephen's working so hard on to help narrow. Now, the biggest limitation on revenue is the inability to raise property taxes by more than 2.5% each year, plus the value of any new growth, unless voters approve a ballot measure to pay more in the form of an override. The last 3-year override we had in Brookline, passed in 2023, was for a front-loaded just under $12 million, $6.5 million in year 1, $2.9 million in year 2, and $2.5 million in year 3, which is this year. The Select Board has put together a 9-member Revenues and Expenditures Committee to analyze the current fiscal situation and make recommendations about what to do next year, including whether to put an override on the ballot, and if so, for how much, for which departments, and in what manner. For example, would it be bundled? Would it be tiered? Would there be multiple options? Would it be by line item? Those are all choices that the Select Board can make in crafting a potential ballot question. Now, the town works with the state in crafting its annual fiscal budget proposals. The governor's budget for FY26 provided a 2.2% increase in government aid from the last fiscal year, as well as a $75 per pupil rate of funding under Chapter 70 aid. That's a significant increase from last year, which was $30 per pupil. Nevertheless, we have a growing structural deficit on account of the aforementioned pressures. So some might wonder, is the current town-school partnership of 60-40 appropriate? How do other communities allocate their spending? For Needham, Newton, and Wellesley, school spending in FY23, as an example, was between 64 and 67%. For Lexington, it was 75%. Now, on the surface, that sounds like more than Brookline, perhaps significantly more. However, not every municipality calculates these percentages in exactly the same way, and the Brookline numbers come with a caveat. The numbers reported to DESE, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, are often lower than the actual percentage of the town budget from a practical benefit standpoint. And that's because some of the town department budgets allocate portions of their spending toward the schools. For example, here in Brookline, the DPW, the Department of Public Works, in FY25 spent $1.35 million out of its budget on the schools. This was in the form of playground maintenance, trash collection, recycling, and snow removal. The buildings department similarly spent a portion of its budget on the schools. These numbers are not reflected in the town-school partnership 60-40 split. In other words, the actual percentage spent on schools in any given year is typically higher than 60%, sometimes significantly so, such as last year when the advisory committee authorized a reserve fund transfer to bridge the school department's FY24 deficit gap. Also to be considered is the political calculation in all this and the town's demographics. Only 18% of Brookline residents have a child in the public school system. It's becoming increasingly difficult to persuade non-parents of current PSB students to allocate more money beyond the 60% plus, particularly in light of an ongoing audit on school spending and allegations by central office administrators of financial mismanagement. For those who still would like to go above the recommended school allocation of $141 million, there is nothing in our existing structure that prevents a town meeting member from proposing an alternative top-line number allocation change. That happened as recently as last year with the Bob Miller Amendment, which intended to add $1 million to the school budget in an effort to preserve K-5 world language. Ultimately, top-line budget numbers are town meetings to approve or disapprove. Any town meeting member can propose a budget amendment. Only the school committee, however, can direct how any operational funds to the schools are spent, while the select board retains authority over school-related capital expenses and debt exclusion projects. And then, Donna, to answer your question specifically about advisory committee controls the reserve fund. The reserve fund is funded from free cash, which forms a portion of town revenue in the town budget. And so there are times where the advisory committee will decide to make a reserve fund transfer to a department that has an unforeseen emergency need. And last year, the schools were having trouble meeting their budget. Certainly the schools weren't unique in this. The fire department has had the need for reserve fund transfers for several consecutive years. And the advisory committee will often approve these because ultimately municipalities, unlike our federal government, cannot deficit spend. With very few exceptions, we must have balanced budgets at the local and state level.
Wow, thanks, David. That's a lot of information. I wanted to ask a quick follow-up. We've heard a lot that a majority of the school's budget, and Stephen, correct me if I'm wrong, but the school's budget in Brookline, the split between salary and non-salary is 85-15, I think. So in other words, 85% of the school's budget is going towards salary and 15% of the school's budget is non-salary. Is there a similar split on the town side budget?
It is quite comparable, yes.
Right. And so on the town side budget, are you struggling with the same, these same gaps that we're struggling with on the school side?
So we do have a gap, but it's not as large. So at the outset in that February report, the gap was approximately 530,000. It then went up to around 700,000 and it's coming back down again. And there's a lot of optimism that we will be able to have a balanced budget even without necessarily a reserve fund transfer.
Got it. Okay. And so,
Sorry, for FY25?
Correct.
yeah, got it. Okay. I want to make
And
sure.
for FY26, there was
Yeah.
a similarly relatively small gap that's being plugged, so we're not particularly concerned about that. I think it's important to keep in mind that the challenges are a little different between school side and town side. So for school side, special education can be a major cost driver. You can't always anticipate what those costs will be exactly. And on the town side, oftentimes it'll be overtime costs that can't always be anticipated for police and fire. Something that affects both sides, though, would be these pensions, health insurance costs that are going way up. In Brookline, we're actually pretty generous in that we end up paying 83% of health insurance. Most municipalities pay significantly less than that to their employees.
Right. And then I think, and Stephen, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's one of the major drivers of the structural gap. Is that right?
Well, I would say it's something that was out of our control. I don't know that
Right.
I call that part of a structural gap, but the projected healthcare costs were far exceeded by the actual healthcare cost increase this year, which was closer to 12%.
So I want to make sure that we're leaving time for people's questions. We have a couple that have come in, and I want to invite people to either raise your hand or put questions in the chat, whatever you prefer. If it's okay, are you guys comfortable if I just start rapid firing some questions your way? The first one is actually for Priya. Does Brockton's DPW contribute to the schools, or does playground maintenance come out of the school budget?
So yes, and I've actually been answering the questions in the chat. I don't know if I was allowed to do
No.
that, but I sent that
Yeah.
direct. But yes, for public consumption. So the way, and I think I don't know if it works differently in cities and towns. I've only worked in cities, but the way it works for us is we do have to pay them from the school budget. So we have to agree upon something every year called Schedule 19 with the city, which is then turned over to DESE and approved by the commissioner. And basically what that document is it is going and cataloging all of the different expenses that the city provides to us. So for example, processing health insurance, processing paychecks, snow removal, and then we pay that back from our overall budget. So we have to agree upon that every year. And in all of the municipalities I've been in, that has definitely been like an area, a little bit of a tug of war where everybody's fighting over resources and making sure that we're all getting, an equitable amount. So we do pay that out of our school budget.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from Karen Schmuckler. Can you clarify the net school spending carryover? Am I correct thinking that DESE views this as a deficit, not a surplus, as there are underfunded mandated obligations, meaning the state minimum obligation was not spent on students?
So yes, sorry. So yes, that's exactly right. DESE does view this as a deficit. It is not considered a surplus. And so that's what I was mentioning before in that a good school budget is one that is perfectly balanced at the end of the year. The reason we're in this position in Brockton is because and this led to the $18 million deficit they were in, is because they had a lack of an accurate historical budget. So when I got there was no clear understanding of, they actually had 80% of their budget in one line. So without a historical budget, you don't know what you're spending on what. So it took a long time to clean it up, and we're still in that process. So I hope for us to get to a completely balanced budget. I think it'll take us at least 3 fiscal years.
Priya, how many students do you have in the Brockton schools?
15,800.
Wow. Okay. can you tell me, because I'm sure that a lot of parents on this call will be interested, how many people work in central office?
Oh, that is a great question. I actually don't know that offhand.
Okay. You can come back to us with that.
Yes, yes. And it's too, well, you know, this also in Brookline, you have the folks that are just central office, and then you have the coordinators that are deployed out.
Mhm.
And that's one of the things that we actually worked on in the Everett budget, as well as making sure it was very clear in our overall budget what were the services and the personnel that were actually deployed to schools versus the ones that were supporting schools. So for example, the ELA coordinator versus human resources. And so that's something we're still working on in Brockton. But yeah, I can get back to you on that.
Yeah, I'd also really, but on a personal level, be interested in how many people are working in the Office of Administration and Finance. I think that that's actually a space where we could use some more FTEs, but I'm not sure anyone else would agree with me.
Donna,
Go ahead.
can I ask you a question also? So, for the past 2 years, we've been in a position of having to close a projected budget gap for the next school year. And the school committee has wanted to be able to make meaningful choices. How do you, Priya, in that situation, balance the need to present your school committee with meaningful choices and prevent a situation like the one that's becoming normalized in Brookline, where you have different groups ending up pleading for their jobs to the school committee, which seems like a very dysfunctional dynamic and a very demoralizing one for all kinds of stakeholder groups?
So yeah, and so there's kind of two parts to that question. So sorry, what was the first part of the question? The first part was
Balancing the need to present the school committee with meaningful options, with the imperative also to not demoralize uh, educators in your district with the possibility of layoffs
Mhm.
and resulting in them pleading for their jobs.
So, that's definitely difficult. We've always, I have always prioritize the student facing services for that exact reason, too, because those are the services that you are going to, if I'm just being very honest about who comes out and who talks at school committee meetings, who talks to the constituents, is those are that's going to be the number one area where you are hearing from your constituents, from all stakeholders, right? The ones who are working for you as your staff, but then from students who need those teachers, from the families, those kinds of things. So we try to keep the options to those areas that are going to impact, that are going to negatively impact the least number of people. There's still always going to be a negative impact. To answer your question about our finance office, we actually have, not saying that this is the right amount, but we have 4 people in our finance office, and 2 administrative assistants, so 6 overall. But these are one of the things that we're constantly looking at. So for example, in my human resources department, it's a much larger department than I had in Everett. And one of the things that we're looking at, and so leads to your exact question, Steve, is about then you have folks who are going to they are in the union and they are potentially going to lose their jobs because we are going to have to shrink a central office in order to make sure that it is running more efficiently. So there are areas that we have additional support in central offices where we are trying to streamline, but it is for the exact reason of the fact that we know that once we do get to that balanced budget, we don't want to have to cut teaching positions. So these are things that we're doing now in preparation for 3 years from now. And what we're doing is, I'm not saying this is exactly what's going to happen. I'm actually presenting it at my next school committee meeting. I'm saying, okay, here's where our human resource offices is. Here's what comparable offices do for this similar or much lesser amount of money. Here's how we believe we can get there to that more efficient usage. And yes, while that is going to hurt for sure in our central offices, we do this with the purpose of knowing that otherwise 3 years from now, those would be resources we would need to take from students. So it really is about really looking far down the line and then again including them in that discussion. Now, my school committee may say, no, this is not a change we want to make, or we need to make it slower, or, they're the ones who get to make that final judgment call. And I present it to them, and they're hearing from their constituents as well. But I think it's important to make sure that I'm bringing them the options and I'm bringing them the recommendations, and that they get a chance to weigh in on them. And again, we're looking several years down the line.
Wow. And Priya, it sounds like you're super hands-on in really driving this process. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I would say that this is probably the most important part of, like, especially when you first enter a district, this is like job one for me. You have to make sure that your budget is clear. I look forward to 2 years from now being able to support, be able to spend more of my time on the instructional aspects, but right now, operations are most important. And when, as a new superintendent coming into a district, the budget has to be my first priority.
Right. We don't have a lot of time left. I have a couple questions that came in for David. David, when, if ever, should the town use reserve funds to close the school's deficit? Is there a process to make that decision? Should there be one? And if so, what do you envision that process being?
So typically the process is to weigh the request by the school department against any requests by other town departments, and then to consider how to prioritize those respective requests. And that's not always an easy calculus, but it's important to remember that the reserve fund is not very large. So for example, for FY25, there's only about 3.3 million in the reserve fund. And so that's why budgeting with as much exactitude as possible is really critical, because that 3.3 million needs to cover any gap that emerges during the year. Otherwise, the municipality can be in a lot of trouble. And so that's always a challenge, and why having the right budgeting practices in place is important. Relatedly, sometimes people ask about free cash. Now, that's also something that should typically be spent on non-recurring, non-operational, one-time expenses for the town. And that's because in order to maintain a AAA bond rating, there are certain policies that a municipality has to adhere to. And the reason why a AAA bond rating is critically important is because that's what keeps our interest rate on our debt service pretty low compared to what it could be otherwise. When I mentioned earlier that this year we're spending, or for next year, we're projected to spend 44 million on debt service, that figure would balloon to something much higher if we didn't have our AAA bond rating, which means that even more money would be taken off the top, which means less money for schools ultimately. So it's a careful balance that the advisory committee is well positioned to calculate. Advisory committee is a town's fiscal watchdog committee, and many of them have a lot of credentials in finance.
So that dovetails nicely into the second question I had for you, which is also about the 44 million in debt service this year. How does that compare to what we've had to carry in recent past years? And how much more will that go up when the major borrowing for Pierce kicks in?
So it's going to be, I don't have those exact numbers in front of me at the moment, but it is going to increase because the borrowing for Pierce actually has not kicked in yet. However, we do have some recent borrowing that's coming off, such as FRR we're no longer paying for, because debt service, obviously, it's not a permanent increase. It's just until the construction from the debt exclusion is completed, but it can last anywhere between 20 and 30 years, depending on the term of the loan, and it will be going up. And that's another reason that the select board decided to put this revenue and expenditures committee together. It's not just an override study committee, it's beyond that, because we really need to find a way to have a sustainable budget moving forward that factors in these variables around our growing debt service, around maintaining our AAA bond rating, and how we balance those sometimes competing factors.
Okay, so I think I'm going to close with this question, which is sort of encapsulates the situation we're in and how hard it is to get out of it. Michael says the basic problem is that Maine revenue, real estate taxes, is capped at 2.5% without an override. while general inflation for both salaries and costs, such as health insurance, is above that. So assuming inflation stays high above 2.5%, we are getting deeper into this structural deficit. I think that's more of a statement, but I'm going to turn that into a question for each of you and just ask, how do you see us addressing that both in the short term and long term? Stephen and David. Priya, I'm wondering, I'm imagining that also impacts you in Brockton. So I'm wondering if you can speak to that in your district as well. Stephen, you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, the only way to address the structural deficit is through regular overrides. That's the only way we can do it. We don't, I mean, well, David has other tricks up his sleeve. I know David has been working to raise revenue capacity for this town for a while. And that will help. But we're going to be in the position where inflation is outpacing our capacity to raise revenue. And so we're going to need regular overrides. But we've been in that position for a while and we've known that. I think the problem with the last override is that it was too small, and we recognized that it was too small. But putting an override together also requires political considerations, like what override can get passed by this town, and it was happening at the same time as the Pierce vote as well. So I mean, we're just going to have continual override votes for this town, but that just addresses the structural problem. That doesn't address how do we, like you raised the topic of having contingency funds, reserve funds. That doesn't, because we also have to address how do we budget for volatility? How do we budget better for factors that are outside of our control that all go the wrong way at the same time? That also has to be taken into consideration, and that can't be budgeted through structural overrides. So we have to be better at doing that. And that's another thing that Dr. Schmuckler raised at the last meeting was, can we set up a contingency for special education costs, which are volatile, increasingly volatile, and
Right, which I
increasingly
think
going
we've
up,
had in the past too.
which we
Yeah.
have had in the past. Yeah. So I think structural override override votes address the structural deficit, but they're not enough. So we also have to put into practice more strong budget practices.
David, do you have anything hopeful to leave us with when we're thinking about short-term and long-term solutions?
A little bit more on the long-term side than on the short-term. I agree with Stephen that short-term, realistically, overrides are the only way to get us out of a structural deficit. Longer term, though, if we were to improve our commercial revenue significantly, that would be an enormous help. Boston and Cambridge very rarely have overrides, and that's because they have strong commercial sectors. Now, obviously, Brookline is not Boston or Cambridge and never will be, but can we do more in Brookline, especially along our major corridors, to increase commercial revenue so that we have the greater capacity to budget the level of services that we would like to see? I think we do, and the select board is actively working on that. It's not something that gets resolved overnight. Commercial projects and economic development in general takes a long time, but it's something that we need to make a concerted effort towards in an effort to try to extricate ourselves from being in a position where an override is the only choice. Also, the flip side, if an override fails, you have no choice but to make cuts. So also programmatic cuts can be made. No one is happy about having to do that. But in a climate where you have to have a balanced budget, sometimes there's no other option. I also think it's important to lobby our state legislators to increase local aid to municipalities. Right now in Brookline, as I mentioned earlier, 79% of the revenue that we receive is from property taxes, and only 5.6 is from the state. If we could be receiving more money from the state, that would help a lot. And the state has more options than a municipality does to raise revenue. Similarly, there are a lot of home rule petitions that town meeting members propose that try to come up with creative ways to bring in more revenue. There's recent discussion of a real estate transfer tax that would be more for affordable housing, But in theory, one could have a home rule petition for a local options tax. So there might be ways that if we partner with our state legislators, we could try to plug some of these gaps.
Oh, and Priya, you have the last word tonight. I'm hoping you can share some hopeful words that you would give to stakeholders in your district as a superintendent when you're struggling between balancing the budget and a structural deficit. What insights would you, or what words of wisdom would you share?
Well, one of the things, I don't know if it's particularly applicable here, but we're just trying to use all of the resources at our disposal. I know we have been applying for more grants than we ever have. We have been, trying to leverage partnerships in the community where there are areas that we can provide programmatic support. And then one of the things that we have been thinking about, because it is a possibility, although one I don't love, is since we do have this net school spending carryover right now, there are districts that actually have a net school spending carryover that they plan for and utilize every year. Springfield is one of those. Now, this is not a practice I had ever heard of before, but I say this to say that it's important to talk to other districts and figure out what are our other options, and to perhaps think about things that we hadn't thought about before, because might it be better if we have these funds now to save them for in the future, so that we can invest in personnel, we can invest in areas where we want to be able to sustain those costs over time. So those are some of the things that we're thinking about in our district right now. So that hopefully we aren't in a bad spot again in a couple of years like we were 2 years ago.
Well, I want to say, before I hand back to Lauren, I want to say thank you so much to the three of you for being here. And for everybody who joined us from home and missed the finale of White Lotus to learn about the Brookline budget process. I actually did learn a lot. I have a gazillion more questions. But I really appreciate the opportunity to have these discussions. I think the chance for us to, to talk in real time with an audience about some of these topics that are impacting our district are too few and far between. So I want to say thank you for spending your evening with us. Stephen, I hope you feel better. And Lauren and Ben, I want to say thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to have this conversation. The BPO's work is absolutely amazing, and I'm so proud to be a part of it.
Thank you, Donna. Well, I want to say thank you to our panelists who participated tonight: Stephen Ehrenberg, Priya Tahiliani, David Pearlman. Thank you for giving up whatever show you're hooked on to come and be with us this evening. And Donna, thank you for taking time out of your very busy, very, very busy schedule right now to moderate this discussion. I know I learned a lot. I was a town meeting member for 11 years, and I learned things tonight that I never really realized now I never really understood. These are just very critically important issues, the things that weigh on everyone right now. And thank you to the 60-something participants we had tonight for taking the time to join this conversation. And we hope you learned something. We hope you came away with answers as well as questions. And thank you for joining us and spending your Sunday evening with us. Good night.